Maybe just the position.
The committee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the members of the full committee waiving on to this subcommittee today be able to participate. Without objection, so ordered. Good morning, everyone. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Again, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's legislative hearing on self-driving vehicles, also known as autonomous vehicles, or AVs. The work we do in this subcommittee is foundational to America's economic future and national security. It is essential we secure our country's leadership in emerging technologies to transform Americans' lives. When the subcommittee began working on AVs under Republican leadership over 6 years ago, I don't believe anyone thought it would be back to square one today in 2023. But here we are, re-examining similar legislation that had previously passed the House unanimously, and that many members of this committee on both sides co-sponsor. We have the prime co-sponsor here, Mr. Latta, today. It is sad and unfortunate that we haven't been able to do anything in this space given all we can benefit from this technology, and we know our adversaries aren't waiting. This hearing serves as an opportunity to level set and discuss why it's dire for us to move legislation forward and not give in to ancillary demands from those who wish to keep the U.S. in the 20th century. By NHTSA 2022 estimates, 42,795 Americans lost their lives in crashes, unfortunately. And for the first 3 months of this year, approximately 9,330 lives were lost. It's clear the status quo is unacceptable. This technology can help roll back these sad fatality statistics, solving the issues of human limitation, impairments, and inattentiveness. We are also in a race against the clock with China. While the United States has failed to advance a national framework that expands testing and deployment, China has unveiled a national strategy to boost testing and deployment throughout their country. Any more inaction from Congress will result in the Chinese defining and owning the technology and its supply chain. We cannot let that happen, folks. Enacting a national regulatory framework without top-down taxpayer subsidies is the true path to securing the future of our AV economy. I'm pleased that the first hearing of this year focused our competitiveness with China, with Jeff Farrar from the newly formed Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association testified on the need to get this done this year. As he laid the case out clearly, America must not lose our edge and see this life-saving and transformational technology to those who don't hold our values. It's also important to think about who this technology will benefit. Many of us take for granted our ability to drive a car, either to our jobs, to visit friends or family, or run errands. But millions of Americans don't have that luxury. In fact, today marks the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disability Act, and that was passed in a bipartisan, Senator Dole led that. So just as that law made sure to protect people living with disabilities from discrimination, we can draw parallels to the bills we're discussing today. I want to thank Mr. Latta again for including language I championed in this discussion draft to ensure people living with disabilities cannot be discriminated against from receiving a license to access this technology, and for ensuring that manufacturers keep in mind how to design their vehicles so that all people can use them regardless of their disability. Of course, these vehicles must be affordable. Studies have shown how impactful AVs will be for transportation and mobility, especially for people living with disabilities, and we should certainly not be dictating who can and cannot access them. So we have Mr. Riccobono. I want to thank you for testifying today and sharing how much this will transform the lives of people living with disabilities. AVs hold so much promise for everyone in this country, in my opinion, so let's make sure this promise ends up a reality for everyone and not just a proportion of the U.S. population. I want to thank Mr. Latta again for his tireless work, his persistence to work to make America the home of manufacturing the vehicles of the future, and for Mr. Wahlberg's efforts to ensure that Chinese auto companies don't take advantage of our openness just as their tech companies have. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the panel for testifying today, and I yield back. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Schakowsky, my friend, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses that are here today, and thank you for the good turnout at this hearing. I know there's a lot of interest in autonomous vehicles, and they do hold a great deal of promise, particularly when it comes to issues of safety. As you heard from the chairman, we're looking at over 40,000 people who are losing their lives on the highways, and we are hoping that it will reduce. And he also talked at length, which I totally agree, on the issue of accessibility, to make sure that all Americans are able to move around in the ways that they want and need to do, in ways that they have not been able to do before. But at the same time, we know that there are a number of unanswered questions that we're going to have to answer before we are able to totally move forward. I'm not saying that we should slow down, but we certainly want to answer the questions. For example, we have heard reports of AVs that are disrupting emergency services, that are snarling traffic and obstructing public transit. We have certainly heard have concerns about workforce issues. I continue to hear from workers in that are making their living driving right now. We are looking at about 4 million Americans who do make a living driving professionally. We have to make sure that we consider that huge change, and Americans should have and finally, the third thing that I wanted to raise as an issue is that Americans should have the same right to seek justice in the courts when they are dealing with autonomous vehicles, if they are harmed, as they are with current vehicles right now. And all of these are open questions right now that we are absolutely going to have to deal with. I know that a lot of work has been done for many years on this. A lot of conversation has been done. But I think these important issues of safety, of workforce, of access of consumers to justice are still not entirely resolved. I want to say a special thank you to leaders, including on our side of the aisle, Debbie Dingell, who really has been working for so many years to come up with legislation. But I want to make it clear that I look forward to working in a bipartisan way to getting this done. I know there is a lot of urgency about getting it done, but let's do it right. Let's work together. We can make our roads safer, our consumers more flexible in their travel options, make sure that consumers are protected. I know that we can get this done in this wonderful subcommittee and beyond. And with that, I yield back my time.
I thank the ranking member, and now I yield to the chairman of the full committee, my good friend, Mrs. Rodgers, for her 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member. I too want to say thank you to all the members who have been a part of bringing us to this place, Mr. Pallone, Ms. Dingell, and certainly Mr. Latta. I too am very optimistic. I'm excited about what autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars are going to mean to so many Americans, truly transformational. I think about our oldest son, Cole. He was born with Down syndrome. He recently turned 16. And like most 16-year-olds in America, he's really excited about getting a driver's license. Now, Mom and Dad aren't quite as confident here yet, but I think about Cole, I think about others living with a disability and what self-driving cars will mean to providing amazing mobility options, transforming their lives. But it's beyond that. It has the potential, self-driving vehicles have the potential to break down transportation barriers, unleash more opportunities, more freedom, more independence. It will mean safe, reliable ways to get to work, go to the doctor, get education, and so much more. Self-driving cars have the potential to reduce death and injuries on our roads. Tens of thousands of Americans that are killed every year on our roads, many due to human error and impaired driving. It will help ensure our transportation future isn't reliant upon supply chains from our adversaries and prevent China from controlling the AI and machine learning technologies and insights gained from this technology. The U.S. is currently at risk of ceding leadership to China. China is currently moving forward with ambitious plans to lead development and deployment of this technology. And we all know that we cannot trust the Chinese Communist Party to set standards for this industry, and we certainly cannot trust them to protect our data and our individual rights. These standards and a regulatory framework must be led by the United States of America. So last Congress, the committee Republicans wrote to Secretary Buttigieg, raising concerns about U.S. approval for Huawei to buy our semiconductor technology for its growing auto business. And sadly, 2 years later, we have not received a response. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration declined our request today to testify, despite weeks of notice. China's ambitions in this industry present a critical economic and national security threat to our country, especially when you consider 7 Chinese car manufacturing companies testing on our roads today, at least 7, testing their self-drive technology that includes video cameras on every car it produces. So I'd also like to thank Mr. Wahlberg for the language that he's contributed as a part of this discussion draft today that reins in Chinese company testing on our roads. This important technology cannot be overstated. The journey alone to deploying self-driving vehicles is going to deliver many benefits, some we haven't even thought of. America must lead, not China. The goal today is to make sure that America continues to lead in the auto sector for the next 100 years and beyond, and self-driving cars are a part of that. I'm pleased to yield the remainder of my time to the leadership of Mr. Latta on this issue.
Well, I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I also thank the chairman for allowing me to wave on today. American automotive leadership is vital for the future of our national security, and autonomous vehicles aren't just the future, they are the present. And the harsh reality is the United States is already falling behind the global stage. Communist China poses an immediate threat to our national security through the use of their driverless cars within our very borders. As the chair of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, I am all too familiar with our ongoing efforts to rip and replace communist Chinese technology from our communications infrastructure. If we do not ensure our laws support innovation, the United States will be forced to consider how to secure our roadways after Communist China has already collected massive amounts of data on our transportation systems. We have the privilege on the Energy and Commerce Committee to look over the horizon and enact laws and regulations that pave the way for American innovation and global leadership. In the 115th Congress, I felt strongly that AV technology and an AV federal framework were the next frontier for legislative action within this committee. Although I have remained focused on meaningful legislation action over the last 6 years, I've been disappointed in the lack of bipartisan action by some on AVs. Finding a solution is essential. Over the last several months, I've been working closely with my friend across the aisle, the gentlelady from Michigan's 6th District, to craft a solution through a federal legislative framework. I'm committed to continuing those conversations, drafting a bill that supports the safe development and deployment of fully autonomous technology. The time to act is now. With a federal roadmap for autonomous vehicle deployment, we as Americans all win. We simply cannot sit back and watch other countries, especially our adversaries, lead because we cannot work together to come to an agreement. I'm pleased we're furthering this discussion in today's hearing, and I look forward to the hearing and hearing from our witnesses. And I yield back to the gentlelady, and again, thank you to the chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. I want to personalize this as well. I have a severe disability, a visual disability, and I waited till it was probably my parents wanted me to wait till I was 18 years old before I got a valid driver's license. And I did get the license and had to go to the ophthalmologist to make sure that that was okay to drive. But I've been very limited in my driving. And I've restricted myself, even though the license doesn't restrict me in any way. No night driving and just around the local area. But you know, if we had these self-driving cars, I would not be restricted. And who knows in the future if I can qualify to get a license because of the disabilities. So I think it's very important that we work on this. Time is of the essence. And I appreciate the bipartisan work that we've done in the past, and I want to get this done for the American people. So in any case, now I'm going to yield to my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. Autonomous vehicles hold the promise of improving safety, expanding mobility, and growing our economy for the future. Fortunately, our nation holds a competitive edge in developing and deploying these technologies. According to KPMG, the United States is among the top 5 most prepared countries for AVs. By contrast, Japan ranks 11th, Germany ranks 14th, and China ranks 20th. But we must preserve and expand this advantage by charting a course that is also in line with the fundamental American values of safety, equity, and workforce protections. AVs will not save lives if they do not operate safely and adhere to state and local traffic laws. They will not bridge the mobility divide if we weaken enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act and preempt state and local accessibility laws. AVs will not benefit society if crash victims and their families do not have the right to seek justice in the courts. And AVs will not create jobs and grow wages if we don't address how AVs may displace workers. We also cannot simply dust off 6-year-old legislation and ignore the substantial issues that have emerged in recent years. We can now see these vehicles in action. Troubling safety incidents are mounting. Liability loopholes are emerging. Workforce impacts are becoming more apparent. So I appreciate the Republican majority's willingness to discuss drafts authored by Representatives Dingell and Latta at this hearing today. I've committed to both of them to work together to find a bipartisan path that promotes the safe, responsible deployment of AVs, and I hope the Republican majority will allow their bipartisan process to move forward and to bear fruit, because a partisan approach stands no chance at ever becoming law. But I'd now like to yield the remainder of my time to Representative Dingell, the author of one of the discussion drafts, who continues to push us that we must address this and pass some legislation. I yield to Representative Dingell.
I thank you, the ranking member, and I'm thanking for him listening to my pushing. But Michigan put the world on wheels and is the global center of automotive manufacturing and innovation. And we must keep it this way. We must keep American leadership. And today, Michigan is the tip of the spear for the autonomous vehicle AV revolution. I'll get Ohio's right there with me. We always have a little Michigan, Ohio. But Michigan, Ohio together is a team you can't beat. Go Red. See, I wore red for you today to show the bipartisanship in more than one way. Hopefully nobody got that on camera. Anyway, I firmly believe in the promise of AV technology, improved safety, expanded mobility, and greater economic prosperity. But if the United States is going to stay at the forefront, Congress must pass a comprehensive bipartisan federal AV framework that supports safe, responsible deployment of AVs and addresses the issues that my colleague, Ranking Member Pallone, addressed. And that's why I am locked arms with my good friend, Representative Bob Latta, and co-led the Self-Drive Act, which passed the House in the 115th Congress. And it's why we have continued to work on bipartisan, bicameral efforts to revive AV legislation ever since. Despite our best efforts, comprehensive AV legislation has not been enacted. Concerns persist. And additionally, as others have expressed, I am concerned that China and other countries are taking advantage of our inaction. At today's hearings, we will hear from witnesses about draft legislation that we've been working on for more than a year. Legislation that I believe can break the logjam. It represents a vision that can address the issues that have emerged over the last 6 years since we passed the Self-Drive Act. And over the course of the last year, we have been in meaningful and productive conversations with Representative Latta on that legislation. I want to make it clear. Between Mr. Latta and I, we have met with every stakeholder. We talk to each other about what every stakeholder is saying. We know the issues. We know what keeps killing this bill, and we are going to get a compromise if it kills us to get this bill done. Listen, I know that, and I really want to thank Chairman Cathy Rodgers, who came to me right after she became chairman and said, I want this to get done. I want this bipartisan bill. And my dear friend, my sometimes chairman, now today, ranking member, who does get tired of my nagging, but he knows how important it is. Between these two draft bills we're considering today, I see a real path forward on achieving bipartisan AV legislation. My bill's not perfect. John Diggle used to say, no bill is perfect. In today's world, the 10 Commandments that Moses brought down wouldn't be. But it's a base to work with. And I want to work with all the members, all the stakeholders. We want your honest feedback. We want to know what you like, what you don't like, what's missing, and what should be struck. Look, these are going to be tough, difficult conversations. They have been for the last 4 years. But I'm tired of people trying to pit us against each other, divide us against each other, then send a bill over to the Senate that everybody knows is going to go nowhere. The House got a bill done and got it through unanimously. We want you to work with us. We want to get this done. Compromise is not a dirty word. And I'm going to be locked arm in arm with my colleague, Mr. Latta. Messaging bills don't cut it. They don't get the job done. We need to come together, and that's one of this committee's greatest strengths. Let me be clear. I'm committed to coming together, and I look forward to today's hearing. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr.
Ranking member yields back. And I want to thank the gentlelady for her passion on this particular bill. And yeah, you're right. Chairman Dingell worked in a bipartisan fashion and got a lot of things done, because I know I was there. My dad was there anyway, and I was a spectator. And he's a legend, and we've got to do this in his memory. So, our witnesses today are John Bozzella, the President and CEO of the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We have Philip Koopman, Associate Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome. Mr. Gary Shapiro, President and CEO of the Consumer Technology Association. Welcome. And Mark Riccobono, who is the President of the National Federation of the Blind. Welcome, sir. We'll have Mr. Bozzella begin. So you're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes. We
Chair
appreciate you
Bilirakis.
being here again. Thanks.
Ranking Member Schakowsky, Chair McMorris Rodgers, Ranking Member Pallone, members of the subcommittee. My name is John Bozzella. I'm the President and CEO of Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Thank you for the invitation to share my perspective on the future of autonomous vehicles in the United States. In my view, there is no safety or mobility solution with as much promise for the traveling public as autonomous vehicle technology. My written testimony outlines the urgent need for a federal AV regulatory framework to get more AVs on the road and protect American leadership in autonomy. I'd like to use this time to describe my most recent experience in an AV just a few days ago in San Francisco. Here's my report from the front. I summoned the AV on my phone. It arrived quickly and for 90 minutes shuttled me to several destinations I chose. The driving was careful and competent. My AV seamlessly navigated double-parked cars, swerving cyclists, pedestrians crossing the street late at night, flashing red lights at intersections, and other vehicle traffic. This wasn't a closed track with foam dummies and fake buildings. This wasn't a DARPA challenge or science experiment. This wasn't a tech show ride and drive with an engineer in the driver's seat, hands hovering over the steering wheel. This was full self-driving in real-world conditions. And the technology worked. It worked perfectly, in fact. It got me where I needed to be, calmly, methodically, carefully, safely. That is what made my experience so powerful, even for someone like me who's seen virtually every innovation in this industry over the last 25 years. And the good news, it will only get better. The software will learn from my ride and every ride in the future. Why? Because the more an AV operates, the more it learns, and the better the technology gets. So if the technology works now and will continue to improve exponentially over time, there's only one remaining question. Do we want this safety technology to exist and the vehicles to be built and to operate here in the US instead of China? This is a question that can only be answered by federal policymakers. The truth is, government has been bogged down on AVs, even with bipartisan support. For almost a decade, there has been virtually no forward movement on federal AV rules. In spite of this lag and the legal constraints, AV innovators have still managed to notch some growth. But there's a ceiling to that growth. Barring a regulatory framework that delivers some certainty in the near future, I predict two things will happen. Some AV companies will not succeed, and the technology and supply chains for this innovation will migrate to China and other countries establishing the right operating conditions. That's as plain as I can say it. A similar dynamic happened with electric vehicle batteries. China locked up the global supply of critical minerals and raw materials for EV batteries because, candidly, it was impossible to process, mine, and build here. That's starting to change, but we're still playing catch-up. It would be a shame if history repeated itself with AVs because the technology works and it continues to improve. Are AVs perfect? No. Do occasional glitches or fender benders matter? Yes. But tens of thousands of traffic deaths on U.S. roads because of reckless, drunk, or distracted humans, that matters too. So does accessible transportation for seniors or individuals with disabilities. So does a chance to reduce traffic congestion and create new jobs and businesses. I'm sure it's rare that somebody from the private sector comes before you to ask, to plead for their businesses to be regulated from the federal government. But this is exactly what we're seeking. We're not asking for taxpayer money. We're not asking you to skirt or bypass a single safety gate. We're simply asking Congress to do something that only it can, pass a balanced federal AV framework with safeguards, oversight, rules, and regulations to give this transformative technology a chance to succeed in the United States. On this point, we're grateful to the leadership of Chairman Latta and Congresswoman Dingell as well as the leaders of the committee for their bipartisan work to keep innovation here and prevent a capital and knowledge exodus to countries like China. Self-driving is hard, it's new, it's different. On behalf of the AV developers and the Americans who benefit from autonomy, let's work together to break America's AV logjam. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it. Very informative. Glad you used that example. So this is what we need to hear. Okay, next is Mr. Koopman, who is the Associate Professor at Carnegie Mellon. You're recognized, sir, for your 5 minutes testimony.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Philip Koopman. In my early career, I served as a U.S. Navy submarine officer in the Cold War and spent several years working in industry, including automotive supplier work. I then became a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, where I've been working on self-driving car safety for more than 25 years. I originated the UL 4600 industry safety standard on autonomous vehicle safety, and I've written 2 books on that topic. I've worked with automotive industry partners such as General Motors and helped the U.S. military improve the safety of their automated ground vehicles. I also have extensive experience with safety-critical computer applications in other industries such as rail transportation, chemical processing, industrial controls, aviation, and so on. I started working on self-driving car safety at Carnegie Mellon University right after they had driven 2,800 miles to San Diego, 98% hands off the steering wheel. That was back in 1995. The industry has since spent perhaps $100 billion worldwide on that last 2% because it turns out to be really difficult, and we're still working on it. There's been really impressive progress, especially on city streets. But after 25 years, we still need a lot more work on reliability and safety. So you can get a perfect ride, as Mr. Bozzella said, but the catch is you need millions of perfect rides, and that's a lot harder. My written testimony provides more detail, so I will summarize 5 key themes this morning. You might have heard talking points that humans are terrible drivers and therefore computers will be better. The 98% human error rate for crash causation mentioned in the hearing memo has no basis in U.S. automotive safety data I'm aware of. There is a 94% error trope, but that's a mischaracterization. Even the original NHTSA report says it's not really blaming the humans, and it's since been further discredited by the chair of NTSB. The reality is that both human drivers and computer drivers will make mistakes, and nobody knows how long it will take for computer drivers to be better than comparable human drivers at the 40,000 fatality number we've been talking about. The mobility, economic, and safety benefits promised by manufacturers will only materialize if self-driving vehicles can be made safe and reliable at scale. The industry is not there yet, and it will easily be many years, if not decades, before the technology fully matures. Issuing overly permissive regulations prematurely based on an assumption that it's already there is going to hurt the public interest. Current regulations do not place any meaningful limits on the ability of companies to develop the technology for fully autonomous vehicles. Moreover, there are significant incentives for companies to cut corners on safety. This, combined with any required private arbitration and generally weak accountability, works against the interests of public safety. The chaos and harm unfolding on our public roads makes it clear that manufacturers pretty much have free rein already. Federal preemption of state abilities to regulate driving behaviors during a multi-year wait for federal regulations can make this even worse. The race that counts for automated vehicles is the race to create reliable and safe vehicle automation technology. To win, the federal government should require companies to adopt their own industry's engineering safety standards and best practices. There was a DOT framework in late 2020 that proposed exactly this. That is a good way forward. Additionally, manufacturers should be required to be transparent about crash data and incidents, as well as be held accountable for safety issues caused by their computer drivers. The economic impact that matters for the next 5 or 10 years or longer is partially automated systems, the so-called level 2, 2+, maybe level 3 features that require driver oversight. This technology is not established to improve safety. Driving automation technology does improve safety in the form of automated emergency braking, but that's not the steering down the road part of the technology. That's the active safety systems. Vehicles with poor driver monitoring and poorly conceived user interfaces are prone to causing injury and death to road users, and that's happening. So that part should be included in automated vehicle regulations, and it is included in one of the bills. In closing, key points I would ask you to keep in mind are, one, companies have shown they will be as opaque if we let them, and that's causing them to lose the public's trust. Two, if the government does not find a way to incentivize companies to be more reliable and safe, foreign companies that do have a regulatory requirement to do that will likely win in the long term. And three, the core issue is public trust. Fake it until you make it has run its course here. If we want to have an automated vehicle industry in the future, Congress needs to act to require transparency, accountability, and adoption of the industry's own safety standards. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, sir. Now I'll recognize Mr. Shapiro for his 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, I am so grateful for your focus today on safety and saving lives, reducing injuries, and empowering Americans. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. The Consumer Technology Association represents over 1,200 of America's leading and most innovative companies, 80% of whom are small businesses, and we produce the CES, the world's most powerful and most fun tech event. It's full of innovation. The last one in January, we have 300 exhibitors just on the mobility area alone, and we invite all of you to CES 2024, where you see a lot of self-driving technology. You know, I last testified before you on this issue with similar testimony, deja vu, in February 2020, and since then I've become increasingly concerned by the lack of progress at the federal level. There's a patchwork of state laws, some 34 different jurisdictions, and this refusal that we have as a federal government to embrace the future alarms me. It is not who we are. I've written 3 books and over 1,200 articles on innovation, and I am scared today to see the inaction that's affecting us. Because as a nation, we have been defined by our progress and our innovation. That's who we are, that's what we do. And Congress has an extremely rich history of being out there and welcoming innovation and embracing it and not listening to other parochial groups that say, slow it down, stop it, it's going to threaten us, it's going to hurt us. And there's very few examples of that, which has allowed us to be a leader in so many different areas of technology and medicine and elsewhere, because we favor the new, we favor the innovative. And the sad thing for us is our adversaries and allies are moving forward without us. And just since the last hearing we had on this in 2020, China, Europe, Japan have all moved forward, and South Korea even as a target, half of its cars be self-driving by 2035. We should be the leader. Instead, we're falling behind. And this is an issue that defines our future. It's an economic issue, a public safety issue, an accessibility issue, and a national defense issue. As an economic issue, it could create $300 billion to $400 billion in revenue by 2035. And of course, as many of you stated, we have to win in this race against China here, because I value our democracy, as I know all of you do, so much that being forced in a way to raise kids the way China does and have that type of social structure is something we all must avoid. And the economy is part of the battle. It's a public health and safety issue. Delay, every year of delay is costing thousands of American lives. You've heard about the loss of over 40,000 a year. 94% of the crashes are because of human error. There's no other example it could be other than the car breaking down, which is very rare, or lightning, or a big hole in the road. Either that, it's human error. And SCVs are never distracted, they're never tired, they don't get drunk, and they don't fall asleep. And they're designed not to speed, which is a contributing factor in many deaths and injuries. But we can't wait for them to be perfect. The perfect should not be the enemy of the amazing. Even if we're only saving 10% of lives in a couple of years, or safety, that is an astounding savings of lives and injuries, and actually economic savings as well, which will translate for consumers in lower interest. And of course, it's an accessibility issue, as you've heard, could create over 4 million jobs and support an aging population, as 1 in 6 Americans are like me, older than 65. And it's a national defense issue. As our adversaries develop self-driving, we'll be unnecessarily risking young American lives who have to fight and drive abroad. AVs are driving today on our roads. There's a lot of success stories. Thanks to innovation by American companies, Waymo is increasing passenger rides tenfold by next summer. Cruise has driverless taxi services in several cities. Aurora has 30 autonomous trucks on the roads in Texas, and 80 self-driving companies are testing across 30 states. Consumers want these products. All the research shows that about 2/3 of Americans are interested in replacing their cars with self-driving vehicles. And not every company will succeed. We've seen failures. Ford, Volkswagen's Argo shut down. One of the reasons they cited, regulatory uncertainty. Local Motors, bankruptcy. Uber and Lyft sold their companies. Not every company will be successful, but we need legislative and regulatory action to move our nation forward, to stay competitive, to save lives, and to reduce and to allow investment, which is a very long time frame in self-driving. So what do we recommend? We need some goals. A national goal, time-bound, on deaths and injuries reduced, would be really helpful. NHTSA has to update outdated safety standards. We think there should be a national policy so that any bill ensures that the federal government remains solely responsible for regulating vehicle safety and performance, and we must expand the exemption authority of NHTSA. It's so tiny right now that it doesn't allow commercial viability and this massive amount of billions of dollars investment that American companies are ready to have. Also, the more exemptions, the more data you collect, the more oversight ability. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to answering questions.
I appreciate it, sir. Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Riccobono, you're recognized, sir, for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Sikowski, and to the Chair and Ranking Member of the committee, and to all members. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here. My name is Mark Riccobono. I serve as President of the National Federation of the Blind, America's transformative membership organization of blind people, and I want to thank the committee for including the voice, experience, and perspectives of blind people in the consideration of autonomous vehicle technology and the necessary legislation and regulatory schemes that must be adopted in order to make sure we have a responsible and meaningful implementation of this technology. In addition to representing tens of thousands of blind Americans, I have ridden, and I think now, autonomous vehicles from half a dozen companies over the last 10 years, and I have been a strong advocate for advancing the accessibility conversation with this industry, beginning with my representation of the National Federation of the Blind to be the first, first and only blind person to drive a car using non-visual access technologies at the Daytona International Speedway back in 2011. More importantly, my wife and I are both blind, and we have 2 blind daughters. And so I'll echo the chairman's sentiment that on a daily basis, we experience the struggles of equal access to transportation. I also want to echo the chairman's comments in beginning by celebrating that this is the 33rd anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was, as noted, a bipartisan effort to protect the rights of people with disabilities and to elevate people with disabilities and able to live in and contribute to our society. This hearing today is an important moment in fulfilling the goals of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The opportunity for our nation to innovate with this technology, but also to make sure that all people with disabilities have equal access to this important form of transportation is an opportunity that really cannot be overstated. Congress has not just the opportunity, but the responsibility to lead on these issues and really bring the lived experience and wisdom of people with disabilities to this effort. And in that respect, there are 2 key principles. The first, of course, is nothing without us. People with disabilities need to be included from the beginning, and I celebrate the members of the committee who have made that a priority in this discussion. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, is that we know from our experience that it's not just including with people with disabilities, that actually our perspective makes innovations better. The access and the perspectives that we bring actually make the development of technology better for everybody. And I'll add a side principle, and that is that especially for blind people, taking humans out of the mix will eliminate the discrimination that many, many blind people feel, especially with rideshare drivers that deny them equal access. Related to this bill, my written testimony has a number of important points that I won't take the moment to emphasize, but I will say that taking discrimination out of licensing schemes, including people with disabilities at the table from the beginning, and making sure that the United States Department of Transportation finds ways to include people with disabilities is important. I'll give one side note, which is although our members are not primarily people who use wheelchairs, there are a number of important considerations and concerns that the committee should keep in mind and that we would elevate. And finally, I would call on the committee to recognize that the United States Access Board can play an important role and is an asset to the federal government in these issues. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. I'll go ahead and recognize myself for questioning for 5 minutes. I want to ask Mr. Riccobono, I'm so pleased again that you're here today and members of the National Federation of the Blind. Again, so many of our friends who advocate for people living with disabilities are here in the audience. I really appreciate you making the effort to be here today. It makes a big difference. I also want to thank you for your support of the amendment I offered last Congress on the infrastructure bill regarding protections from discrimination for disability, for the disability community. I'm still disappointed the majority at the time didn't allow it to be voted on as part of that package that was enacted without our input. Can you briefly share with us your experience with self-driving vehicles and maybe elaborate on how much of an impact this will have for people living with disabilities, and elaborate again on what opportunities this could bring if this technology is developed specifically with this community in mind. Is this a major priority for the National Federation of the Blind?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, great question. Well, obviously, especially for blind people, but many people with disabilities, blind people are excluded from the driving class. You know, what I like to say is that 100% of accidents are caused by sighted drivers. I think I said that. Still gets a laugh. I think I said it last time I testified. But the reality is that transportation is a significant barrier. Easy transportation, access to affordable transportation, but also, as I alluded to, especially today in the rideshare environment, but it's always been true with taxi drivers as well, there is a level of discrimination against people with disabilities, especially people, blind people who use service animals. So there's a tremendous opportunity here. But as I've noted, I've had the opportunity to ride in many autonomous vehicles, being involved in these discussions over the last decade, and I had a similar experience, as already has been shared, related to Cruise in San Francisco. And I will say, you know, I was in a vehicle that was not 100% successful. The vehicle actually had an issue at one point, and I was really kind of excited not to have a perfect experience, because it illuminated how much thought has been put into both the safety and help teams that are behind this technology. As a blind person, not being able to know, you know, look out the windshield and see what's happening outside the car in that moment. And I will just say we were at a red light, and when the light turned green, the car failed to move. But the help team engaged very quickly, was very communicative about what was going on, And I was impressed by the user experience that I will say is much different than cars that I've been in with real human drivers. So for people with disabilities, but really I think all people, there's a tremendous opportunity here to not only innovate by incorporating new ideas about accessibility, but to increase the safety and eliminate discrimination that happens in rideshare, where we have humans that are continuing to discriminate against people with disabilities or people of color. I think the technology and the thoughtful approach that the industry, but also Congress is taking in these conversations, give me a lot of hope for the safety and implementation of this technology.
Well, thank you very much. And I know in my area, in the Tampa Bay area, most areas do not have a strong public transportation system. Or we are not fortunate enough to have a metro, what have you. So I think it's very appropriate that we have the discussion today. And the work you're doing, sir, to ensure people living with disabilities is widely supported, including by the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities, who sent a letter to this committee regarding the need to move AV legislation as soon as possible. I'd like to submit that for the record without objection, so ordered. I know I don't have a lot of time. Well, why don't I go ahead and yield back and recognize the ranking member. I'll submit the rest of the questions for the record. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Copeman, you talked about, used the word trust. The assurance that Americans have when we talk about autonomous vehicles, trust becomes a very important issue. I want to thank the advocates for highway and auto safety. Cathy Chase, who's here in the audience, who has done a lot of work talking about what we need to do to make our highways safer. But I want to ask you, Doctor, at this point, do you feel that we could be saying that autonomous vehicles are, in fact, safer than human drivers?
At this point, thank you for the question, Ms. Tchaikovsky.
Press the button.
It is on, yes. Where we are is that it's too soon to tell how it will turn out for fatalities. There's data saying it's a little bit safer, maybe it's not as safe for crashes, and we're going to see how that plays out. But it's way too soon to tell for fatalities. And the issue is that while human drivers absolutely make mistakes, computers make mistakes too. And the 94% number you recently heard, in the report that comes from, that's a NHTSA report, it says 94% involved some element of a human, but sometimes the human didn't clean up a mess. The very next sentence in that report says, this does not mean the driver was to blame. So it's important to realize the jury's still out. We have a long way to go to find out how this turns out for fatalities.
Let me also ask you this. You mentioned in your testimony a number of ways that AVs should be subjected to safety regulations. But let me ask you this. What are the kinds of things that Congress should be thinking about as a start, and the role that we can play right now in assuring the kind of trust and safety for autonomous vehicles?
I'll leave it up to you all.
Well, I think that the main principles have to be transparency, accountability, and independent oversight. But for something very actionable, NHTSA already has an advance notice of proposed rulemaking from December 2020 that has a pretty good starting point for a framework, including requiring conforming to engineering safety standards, telling engineers how to get the design right to address things. And so just moving that ANPRM forward would provide a really robust platform to get consensus from both sides on how to provide. So people say we need a regulatory framework. We have one. It's been sitting there since December 2020. We need to move forward.
Thank you. I also just wanted you to comment on whether we should consider what's happening, what could happen to the workforce as we move forward with autonomous vehicles, and if we should be working to do some legislation in that regard.
Absolutely. Any new technology will bring with it workforce disruptions. There are no exceptions. That just always happens. So I think it's really important to consider the workforce impact. There'll be jobs, no doubt. Eventually there'll be jobs lost, but there's going to be opportunities for a lot of new jobs, and in many cases, much more highly skilled, better jobs that become available.
Thank you for that. I wanted to also add to something to the record. Several transportation labor organizations have written letters that are calling on Congress to account for the potential loss of jobs, and I seek and I ask for unanimous consent to put 3 of them in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. Really, that's the gist of my questions, but what I would like you to, there's a lot of sense of urgency in this room. How long, do you have any projection, do you see it will take us to get to the point that we can really move significantly forward?
I think there's 2 aspects to that. I'm talking about 5 or 10 or 25 years before we see the complete transition. That doesn't mean we have to wait that long to see benefit. We can see benefit essentially right away if we're careful to deploy the technology in niches where we can ensure that the public harm is not increased and that there's a public benefit. So it's absolutely fine to deploy the technology in a sensible, incremental way, making sure we do no harm as we do so. That can still proceed quite quickly, but it's going to need some regulatory frameworks to ensure that the industry is conforming to their very own industry engineering safety standards as they do it.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Incremental may be the word. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Ms. Rodgers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'd rather say the word is nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And this is an idea whose time has come. And I'm so excited about what this transformational technology is going to mean on so many different fronts. But I wanted to start with Mr. Riccobono. And just again, thank you for your powerful testimony. And it's great to have so many in the audience today advocating for those with disabilities. I wanted you to speak about the work that you're doing with these associations and members on the accessibility needs for people living with disabilities, and how limiting will it be for your members if this important technology only comes to fruition in certain parts of the country or just certain populations, and if it's not available, is there a workforce to address your mobility needs?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. One thing that has been, I think, impressive in the trajectory of this technology is the inclusion of people with disabilities in the discussion of how this technology is developed, what the user interfaces will be. So it's not just putting a person with a disability in a vehicle and pressing go, that making sure that people with disabilities from getting connected with a vehicle at the curb to having independent control within the vehicle to know what's happening, to being able to get there safely, that we've been having discussions all throughout the process with the various companies and the industry on this. You know, what's really important, especially for a person like me, is that ultimate fully autonomous driving, right? Because the pathway we're on is helpful, but you know, if there's still a requirement that you have to be able to see out the window to take control of the vehicle at some point, that's not ultimately going to benefit someone like me. And the other thing I'd say is that I agree that, you know, people who live in many parts of this nation where there is limited or no public transportation system, the ability to independently get a car to come to you and take you to your doctor's appointment or some other important aspect of work or even fun for that matter will be life-changing. And I don't use the term life-changing very often, But the transportation barrier
you.
that so many Americans face in getting
Thank you.
access to reliable transportation is, it is transformative.
Yes, thank you. I have too many other questions, but I just appreciate that perspective so much. You know, I have deep concerns about the Chinese Communist Party embedding themselves in American infrastructure, and I do believe that there's an urgency. We're spending billions of dollars right now to rip and replace Huawei equipment from our telecommunications system, and inaction on the AV front is letting history repeat itself. And you know, we know there's at least 7 Chinese companies testing on our roads today. So to the question, I want to start with Mr. Shapiro. How long? You heard how long should it take? What components of the discussion drafts before us today will spur the innovation, and which are a recipe for failure? And then I want to give Mr. Bozzella a chance to also answer that.
Is this in the context of China or overall?
Well, I'll just say for, I'd like to, let's keep it on the context of the bills before us and AVs, and just what's going to spur the innovation, and what parts of these bills do you think are a recipe for failure?
I think Congressman Latta has presented a great framework that will allow rapid development of DTV. It will ATV as well. It will give the encouragement that the companies need. They're on like 8-year, 10-year planning cycles. You have to build a factory, invest billions of dollars. You have to know where your government's going to be. And right now, for example, the limitation on exclusions is so low that there's no commercial way you could do that and make money. 2,500 vehicles just doesn't cut it for a car company, considering everything's there. Hiring the workers, training the workers, doing all the things that are necessary. And I think Congressman Latta has done them beautifully, as have other parts of the bill. I'd like to see a timetable in there personally of when will be at certain guideposts. I think it's always good, especially in the business world, to have measurements so you can measure your success.
Thank you. I'm going to take back my time and yield the remainder to Mr. Mazzella. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair McMorris Rodgers. So very quickly, 3 things that the bills do that are really important. One, they ensure that NHTSA reimagines and modernizes federal motor vehicle safety standards for this future. That's critical to innovation and development here in the United States. Secondly, we need a bridge, because it's going to take NHTSA some time to do that. We need a bridge that ensures safety. So NHTSA would expand under this bill exemptions ensuring vehicles that don't have specific traditional technologies like steering wheels and pedals are as safe or safer than the vehicles they would replace. So that's the second piece. The third piece that's really important is let's make sure that we adhere to and respect the traditional roles of the federal government with regard to design, construction, and operation of vehicles, and the traditional roles of states with regard to licensing and traffic enforcement. So
Thank you.
3 important things.
Thank you. Yes, my time has expired. I do have further follow-up questions that I will submit in writing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Lee yields back, and I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask some questions first about preemption of state and local laws, and then about forced arbitration. So if we spend too much time on the first one, I may cut some of you off because I want to get to the second one. For people with disabilities, AVs are a transformational technology that holds the promise of greatly improving independence and mobility, but we can't overcome barriers to independence by preempting state and local accessibility laws and weakening the enforcement of the ADA. The Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities, which includes organizations like the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and the American Foundation for the Blind, has submitted a letter for the record expressing concerns that preemption language, and I quote, regarding the design, construction, or performance of AVs could harm efforts to improve access and benefits for disabled and other historically underserved travelers. And I was going to ask, Mr. Chairman, unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So let me ask some questions. Mr. Riccoboni, would you be concerned about federal legislation preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
Well, thank you for the question. What I would say to that is that, the accessibility requirements need to be a standard across the country. This is a problem we see sometimes in other areas where there's variation. So the federal government, I think, plays an important role, and that's where I referenced the United States Access Board is a tremendous resource for NHTSA and others on this issue to set a reasonable and powerful standard to make sure whatever happens in this area, that it is fully inclusive for people with disabilities.
Thank you. Mr. Shapiro, do your members support preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
For, in the sense of building cars, absolutely, because to build a car on a national basis as opposed to do it for local requirements, the economies of scale are such that we'll be charging consumers more because if there are local requirements. And it has been how cars have developed in our regulatory structure, is that the safety features of the car are regulated nationally. In terms of driver requirements, things like that, that's a state look, and that's what this legislation envisions.
And then, Mr. Bozzella, same question. Do your members support preempting state and local laws adopting accessibility requirements for the benefit of people with disabilities?
I think accessibility is critically important, and it's one of the opportunities we have in terms of the benefits this technology provides. However, we need to build one fleet for the nation, and so those accessibility requirements should be established in a way that allows us to make sure that they are part of every vehicle, one fleet of vehicles for the nation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Koopman instead on the forced arbitration. This same letter from the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities encourages us to prohibit forced arbitration clauses in AV legislation to ensure AV providers can be, in quotes, held accountable for injuries and property damage. So, Mr. Koopman, what would be the effect of forced arbitration agreements imposed on AV users on mobility and safety for the disabled community?
I think that a forced arbitration provision would make it much more difficult for the disabled to assert their rights and hold companies accountable. Mr. Riccobono mentioned the problems they have with ride-hailing networks. I remember a time when we were promised that ride-hailing was going to solve all the mobility needs and deliver food to food deserts and help out folks who had mobility problems. I remember that time, and it didn't work out. And my understanding is forced arbitration has played a large role in that outcome.
And then lastly, are there unique safety and operational considerations with respect to AVs and people with disabilities that we should take into account as we consider the AV legislation?
Yes, there are, and the engineering safety standards I mentioned actually speak directly to those. For example, and Mr. Riccobono again was talking about how the companies are addressing this, and that's great that some companies are addressing it. That things that if you don't have sight, that signs inside the cars aren't going to work. If you're hearing impaired, audio cues aren't going to work. And so the things definitely have to be taken into account in designing these vehicles.
All right, thanks so much. I really think that the deployment of AVs doesn't have to come at the expense of state and local accessibility laws and the rights of the disabled to seek justice for ADA violations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The ranking member yields back. Now I recognize Dr. Bouchon for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing. That's an important step in establishing a clear federal regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles in the United States. While we are years from broad deployment, I hesitate to call this an emerging technology because it is already being utilized across our country with more than 44 million miles traveled here. While the United States has been a leader in developing various autonomous driving technologies that can help make our roads safer, our competitors abroad in Europe and China are closing the gap with us as developers in the U.S. are stuck in regulatory purgatory. That didn't sound quite right, but regulatory purgatory. One technology that I believe is critical in the future of this industry is LiDAR, or light detection and ranging, that uses pulsed lasers to map the surrounding environment. In 2018, the United States had over 85% of the LiDAR market share worldwide. Today, we have less than 50%. China has identified this as a key enabling technology in its Belt and Road strategy and is increasing their production at a feverish pace. They know this technology will not only be pivotal in technologies like AVs, but also in public transportation, industrial automation, defense, and more. This seems eerily similar to 20 years ago when the CCP recognized how critical semiconductors would be and took steps to dominate the market. Today, we are still struggling with that aftermath. We cannot let this happen again with LiDAR or any AV technologies. So, Mr. Shapiro, do you think that enacting legislation like the Self-Drive Act will help boost U.S. production of critical technologies like LiDAR and prevent such bottlenecks from happening again?
I think that the legislation going forward on SCTV as proposed will be a great big step in ensuring that does not happen, because the alternative is there's not going to be a lot of investment in the U.S. in self-driving. In terms of the specific focus on specific ingredient technologies like LiDAR technology, you'd have to look at the patent portfolio ownership and see if patents are being violated. I think there's different steps that government can take if it's seeking to protect a critical part of a supply chain like LiDAR, or as has been done with chips. But that's a policy decision. I think the important thing is that we go forward and start letting companies know that this is going to be mass-produced technology so they can invest in the United States and manufacture in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the critical thing, investment in the United States, and we certainly don't want to inhibit that. Mr. Bozzella, do you think that U.S. manufacturers would be able to meet the production caps proposed in Representative Lada's discussion draft before the committee today?
Yes, I do, but I'm more concerned that if we don't expand those exemptions and provide a bridge to test and deploy at scale, that there are going to be fewer companies doing less innovation here in the United States.
And do you think, are there any other regulatory hurdles that this legislation should address to ensure that they can?
Yes, we should ensure that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration does the hard but necessary and critical work of modernizing federal motor vehicle safety standards.
Great. I mean, my hope would be that this increased production would lead to more AV deployments in rural areas like Indiana's 8th District. As an example, well, it seems like I'm getting a lot of laughs today for some reason. Where individuals with impaired vision or other disabilities, the elderly and every Hoosier would be able to benefit from AVs. I mean, rural America has been addressed, right, and it's critical. It's a bigger challenge probably than urban America is. So, Mr. Riccobano, would you agree that implementing the national regulatory framework like the Self-Drive Act would accomplish this goal of increasing access in rural America to individuals who have impaired vision or other disabilities?
Yeah, 100%, especially with accessibility and the inclusion of the wisdom of people with disabilities being central to it. So I agree.
Thank you. And I also, just in closing, I want to make sure that safety is a critical issue, and we obviously do not want to overlook that, and that's something I think we can find solutions for. Also, you know, the displacement of workers potentially is another thing we can find solutions to, and I think ultimately at the end of the day it will create more jobs out there. But it will increase access to the roadways for the people that we have discussed and improve safety. Thank you. Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Now I recognize Representative Clark from the great state of New York for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank our ranking member, Chakowski, for holding today's hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here to testify on these bills today. Before I get to my questions, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the irony in this subcommittee holding a hearing on the need for regulatory certainty for autonomous vehicles, almost all of which will be electric. And then the fact that tomorrow our full committee plans to mark up multiple bills that will reverse clear federal rules on vehicle emissions in an attempt to thwart investments the auto industry and Congress have made in electrification. As the young people say, just saying. Last month, unfortunately, an automated vehicle driving system activated a vehicle with an automated driving system activated ran into the sidewalk in my district, killing one of my constituents and seriously injuring another. And while I recognize the clear differences between highly automated, fully autonomous vehicles and the advanced driver assistance systems present in this incident, it would be unfortunate if this committee did not recognize the present dangers of automated technology being marketed and used in vehicles today. So we cannot look so far into the future that we fail to protect our constituents today, just saying. I'm also, like Ranking Member Pallone, concerned that broad preemption of state and local laws could limit the ability of cities like New York to enforce their local traffic laws, including the AVs are allowed to operate. Mr. Bozzella, you state in your testimony that states should continue to have jurisdiction over operation of vehicles on public roads, including enforcement of traffic laws. Could you elaborate on that position, and how does broad preemption of state and local laws impact and potentially limit safety?
Yes, well, thank you very much for the question. I very much appreciate it. The key here is, to my mind, is making sure that we recognize the traditional roles that state and local governments have. And I have a background in local government, having worked for the mayor of the city of New York back in my day, so I appreciate where you come from. It's really important that we do that, but it's also important that we recognize the federal role with regard to design, construction, and performance of vehicles. And so that's what we're looking for. AVs are going to follow local traffic laws. AVs currently follow local traffic laws where they are already operating, and that will be true in the future as well.
Very well. Dr. Copeman, would broad preemption prevent cities from prohibiting AVs in certain areas like school zones or traffic laws requiring full stops at stop signs or safe lane changes?
I think federal preemption could be a problem. In New York City, for example, right now is the only place in the country that requires companies doing testing to follow the industry standard testing safety standard, J3018. It's the only place in the country that does that. And if there's federal preemption, you'd get that taken away from you.
Okay, so state and local governments have a duty to protect the public from vehicle crashes, a role that becomes even more important in the absence of strong federal action and leadership. And since NHTSA's inception, the relationship between federal, state, and local law have been clear. Once a federal safety standard is in effect, state and local governments cannot enact or enforce different safety standards. I'm concerned with any proposal that creates a regulatory black hole where the federal government could fail to prescribe safety standards and state and local governments would be prohibited from filling that void and enforcing local traffic laws. There's a consortium of 7 organizations representing the nation's state and local elected and appointed officials. They've written a letter calling on Congress to preserve state and local authority to promote traffic safety, and I ask for unanimous consent that this letter be entered into the record. My final question, as co-chair of the Smart Cities Caucus and the former chair of the Cybersecurity Subcommittee at the Committee on Homeland Security, I'm especially conscious of the threats posed by increasingly digitized and connected technologies. Dr. Copeman, would you consider an autonomous vehicle that does not adhere to adequate cybersecurity practices an unreasonable risk to roadway safety?
I think it's really important that the vehicles, all vehicles conform to the industry standard for cybersecurity. This is not just an AV problem, it's an any vehicle with a camera problem. And so EVs get swept into that as well. Yes, they should conform.
Very well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. AVs, clearly, from our discussion today and research otherwise, have the potential for extensive transformation. But we cannot fully realize the potential if we do not lead the world in this technology. I think we'd all agree with that. My legislation, the Safe Car Act, is included in Mr. Latta's draft we're discussing today. I also sent a bipartisan letter last week with Representative Dingell, Latta, and Vesey outlining the concerns with Chinese AV companies testing in the United States. It is frustrating to think that China will not allow American companies to any extensive nature test their AVs in China. When you stop and think about the competitive problem that is, but also the security problem of having more data collected make AVs better, day by day, drive by drive, think how much data the CCP is collecting on the United States and its citizens. That's a concern. I'm thankful that Secretary Buttigieg did respond to this letter publicly, and I think it's a concern that we have. So, Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm the chairman at this point in time. So there is no problem with unanimous consent to have that letter included in the record. I hear no objection. It's imperative that we approach this issue from both sides, boosting American AV leadership by offering regulatory certainty and protecting against national security and competitive risks through increasing China's concerns and addressing those concerns. My legislation seeks to address the latter. Mr. Koopman and all the panel, thank you for being here. Do you support the language in the discussion draft that I authored, which would give the Secretary of Transportation authority to prohibit or limit testing vehicles within the U.S., depending on whether companies are under the control of the CCP or if companies within China pose a threat to the security of the United States?
Sir, I'm here to talk about safety, and I don't really have an opinion on that topic.
I'm concerned about that, and we could talk about that further.
I'd love to follow up with you and understand more.
Yeah.
At this point,
I know that you have been a consultant to numerous companies, including, I believe, some Chinese companies as well, but we'll leave that for further discussion.
No, sir, I'm not consulting to any Chinese company.
I'm interested with your work with the Voluntary Standards Committee. Are there Chinese companies that participate in this? And second, given their numbers, do they have an outsized role on development of the standards?
There are Chinese representatives on all the standards I'm aware of. I don't have a list for some of the ISO standards I work on. For sure, there are Chinese participants in UL 4600. They absolutely do not have an outsized influence. They're not calling the shots by any stretch. It's the direction is set by the U.S. and by Europe.
Yeah. Well, the concern is that there are Chinese involved. Let me move on to the next question. Turning to a separate issue, I'm an avid motorcycle guy, co-chair of the Congressional Motorcycle Caucus, lifetime member of the American Motorcycle Association. As I said, true autonomous vehicles will offer many safety benefits, but many in the motorcycle community are concerned the technology is able to properly detect and protect motorcyclists on the road. We're very different from pedestrians and bicyclists because we are in and amongst the traffic. Mr. Shapiro, how are AV companies considering motorcyclists in their safety tests, and how does the technology used by level 4 and 5 autonomous vehicles differ from those in self-proclaimed full driving mode when it comes to motorcycle awareness and safety?
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. My understanding is that they are taking into account motorcyclists, bicyclists, and they don't have blind spots on self-driving vehicles as opposed to what human drivers have in many vehicles. So it'll definitely be safer for motorcyclists in a self-driving environment. And it's even getting safer today before we get there, just with active collision avoidance, things like that. So motorcyclists are identifiable on, my understanding is, most self-driving vehicles today.
They're out amongst the traffic, unlike bicyclists and pedestrians to a greater degree.
Absolutely.
And going in between. So it is a concern, and I hope we continue to address that. I appreciate your response. And
could I come back to your China question?
I think I've run out of time. I'd love to have you come back to the China question, but we'll talk about it later. I now yield to Mrs. Dingle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I laid out in my opening remarks, I am very firmly committed to working towards bipartisan agreement on AV legislation. Earlier this spring, Rep. Lada and I agreed to roll up our sleeves and get to work on finding a path forward. Our staffs have been meeting regularly with each other, engaging all the stakeholders. I've also been directly engaged in having good bipartisan conversations, not only with Rep. Latta, as well as Chair Rodgers, Ranking Member Pallone. And I also want to say that the ranking member of this committee, Jan Schakowsky, has been for years now also involved in being all these meetings, and she's getting to know the industry well. She loves it. And as my colleague, who's currently sitting in the chair, mentioned, we led a letter with Rep. Wahlberg, Rep. Latta, and Rep. Veazey about the national security and competitiveness concerns related to Chinese companies deploying AVs on U.S. roads. And I look forward to addressing this mutual concern as part of our bipartisan AV legislation. What does all this work demonstrate? It shows that we can have meaningful bipartisan collaboration on AVs this Congress. And we got a lot more work ahead of us. I'm committed to continuing this important work with my Republican colleagues and my colleagues on this side of the aisle to forge and advance comprehensive bipartisan AV legislation. And I'm confident that Rep. Latta also really wants to get a bipartisan AV bill done as well. So we are in lockstep. My first question for all of the witnesses is, are you committed to continuing to work with Rep. Latta, myself, you, and others as we craft and move forward bipartisan AV legislation this Congress? Are you willing to make that commitment, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
A yes from everybody. Thank you for those collective commitments. They were collective, too. Second, do you agree that it would be harmful overall to the prospects of enacting any meaningful AV legislation this Congress if the House or Senate move forward with a strictly partisan bill? Yes or no? I better go down the line. Mr. Rossello?
Yes, we need a bipartisan, bicameral bill.
Thank you.
Bipartisan sounds good to me.
We love bipartisan.
Agree, bipartisan in the spirit of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Great. In the spirit of bipartisanship, in reaching compromise across a diverse group of stakeholders, do you think we can collectively overcome the obstacles of the past on AV legislation, and will you work with us to do so? Down the line again.
We must, because we're out of time.
I'm happy to work with anyone to ensure the safety of this technology and its benefits.
The House passed legislation unanimously. There's no reason it can't do it again.
And I will say, I believe that there's no effort to diminish people with disabilities in this process, so yes.
Thank you. I had to bite my tongue and say the United States Senate sometimes, but I'll behave. John Dingell is thinking it above. Now I have another question. As I mentioned at the top, I share the concerns of my colleagues, Rep. Wahlberg, both on national security and competitiveness fronts, regarding the deployment of Chinese-made AVs on U.S. roads, and I thank him for his leadership with me on this issue, and Mr. Latta and Veazey. Mr. Bozzella, could you elaborate on the very real impacts to American competitiveness, our supply chains, and the American workforce if Congress fails to finally advance comprehensive bipartisan AV legislation?
Yes, I think it's critical that we do so. I mentioned in both the written and oral testimony that I have a concern and that we're at a crossroads. And without a comprehensive AV policy framework, that companies are not going to be able to succeed in the way they need to. What we need to do is allow companies to safely scale so that they can provide these benefits. And so importantly, NHTSA has the data they need to make sure that motor vehicle safety standards are modernized and that we have a regulatory framework going forward. If we don't do that, our competitors in other nations will seize this opportunity.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, for your important testimony and responses on the two AV bills included in today's hearing. Again, going to reinforce, I'm committed, and I know my colleagues are committed to working with Rep. Latta, the members of this committee, and all of the interested stakeholders on getting the policy right and drafting comprehensive bipartisan AV legislation for the safe deployment of this technology. Thank you to the Energy and Commerce Committee leadership for holding this important hearing. And this is the beginning of getting it done this year. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yield back.
I'm all for that. Okay, the gentlelady yields back, and I'll recognize the gentlelady from Arizona, my good friend, Miss Lesko. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm a huge supporter of autonomous vehicles. I think they're very beneficial to everyone. I think they'll make the roads more safe. I also think they'll be very beneficial to senior citizens and the disabled. In fact, in Arizona, my home state, our Republican Governor Ducey was put in policies that really incentivized autonomous vehicle companies to come to Arizona. In fact, we have Waymo One, which operates 24/7 across 225 square miles in Metro Phoenix area. I've rode in one of them in downtown Phoenix. In the city of Peoria, Arizona, where I live, we had a robo-ride medical autonomous electric vehicle that operated in a healthcare district where there were home to more than 100 medical facilities and more than 500 senior living residences. We also have May Mobility, which is funded by AARP, operating in Sun City, Arizona, which is a senior citizen community, and they have two wheelchair accessible vehicles that operate to help senior citizens get around. So, Mr. Riccobono, sorry if I said your name wrong, you indicated that increased deployment of autonomous vehicles would significantly improve the independence and economic prospects for people with disabilities and mobility limitations. In my district, the Valley Wave Project, which is May Mobility, operates a wheelchair-accessible vehicle with additional audio and visual accessibilities or accessory features. However, under the current regulations, these deployments use existing FMVSS-compliant vehicle designs and modify them to be more accessible. My question is, how can the deployment of purpose-built automated vehicles enabled by this legislation unlock even greater accessibility designs from the ground up?
So it's a great question. I would say two things. One is I think there is a real opportunity here to innovate around accessible design, especially in the physical environment. When we think about building vehicles that don't require some of the controls that we've had in the past. I also think, part of this is we need to build that bridge to the future. So really centering people with disabilities in terms of physical design. There's still innovations to be had there. So I know my colleagues, especially who do utilize wheelchairs, have concerns that we can use some of the existing exemptions and modifications while we get to a future where we have safety restraints that work for all types of people, including those who use various varieties of wheelchairs.
Thank you. Mr. Shapiro, you mentioned that autonomous vehicle technology will empower millions of Americans. I agree with you, providing greater independence and mobility for seniors and people with disabilities. In my district, again in Sun City, Arizona, we are seeing just that with the AARP sponsoring the deployment of May Mobility's wheelchair accessible vehicles in service of a retirement community. Arizona is home to a growing retirement population, and this will bring increased mobility needs as residents age. My question is, what can we do to ensure we're leveraging autonomous vehicle technology to meet the needs of populations who are aging and may have subsequent mobility limitations? My next question is, please expand on what you wanted to talk about on competition with China.
Thank you very much for those questions. So just to lay the groundwork, in 2021, there was 42,000 plus deaths, 1.7 million injuries in the United States with vehicles. 4.3 million accidents, collision. Think of the money every American will save on insurance if we could even cut those down by half. Think of how the hospital rooms will be emptied out and the doctors could do what they should be doing in other areas. The nurses, the anesthetists, so many other people. There'll be a huge savings. It'll benefit every American, not just those with disabilities. As a person on the panel who's over 65, I say I look forward to it because I could get a lot of work done as opposed, when I'm going on longer drives and things like that I'd appreciate. That would add to our economy. In terms of China, I have long maintained that we should treat China the way they treat us. We should have reciprocity. If they're not letting us test our vehicles there, we shouldn't let them trust there. And that goes into a lot of other areas, but you're focusing in this area specifically. We've had a business at a big event in China. I've had to deal with it. I've had to have the government partnerships. It's a longer discussion about China, but clearly they are our biggest long-term strategic threat, not only militarily, but in terms of what the type of lifestyle they want compared to what we want our kids and grandkids to be. So if you're talking about China, I'm interested.
All right, thank you, and I yield back.
My friend from the state of Florida, Mr. Soto, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman. Autonomous vehicles are part of a bold future for the United States. And I envision many benefits and also recognize challenges that we're going to have to negotiate through. I think about the empowerment for so many Americans. We've heard from Mr. Riccobono already about how it could help Americans with disabilities, also seniors and young people. Advancements in technology can increase public safety, as was testified by Mr. Shapiro and others. We have challenges, though, obviously. We have a long road ahead to advance the technology. We have job disruptions in training and retraining that are real, and we want to make sure to get on the proactive side of it. We need to ensure these systems are resilient to cyber attacks and ensure we have access to the courts in the case of negligence. In Central Florida, we have BEEP, which is the longest running local transit system in the nation, way back in 2019. That's how new this technology is. They take veterans in Lake Nona from different areas in the city to the VA hospital. They take families to McMorris for cancer treatment, and tourists around the Lake Nona area. They've also been used in Chairman Bilirakis' area in Tampa Bay. I'm sure he's familiar with, and so we need to encourage companies like this with new and innovative technology. We also need to see where we need to delineate between what new laws NHTSA needs and what existing authority they already have. Mr. Bozzella and Mr. Koopman, Dr. Koopman, my first question is, so NHTSA has exemption authority and expertise already. Take these bills aside for a second, right? This is where we're kind of going. What do you think is the additional authority and guidance they will need to keep pace with the development of autonomous vehicles? We'll start with Mr. Bozzella and then go to Mr. Koopman.
Thank you for the question. I think the most important thing NHTSA needs is data. What they need is they need to understand what's working. They need the data to be able to modernize motor vehicle safety standards. Right now, those standards depend on feet and hands and eyes. And so vehicles without steering wheels and pedals need modernized standards. So the agency needs the data. What the bills, both bills do is give NHTSA a framework for that, to collect that data at a much greater rate and more quickly to modernize those standards.
Dr. Koopman, what additional authority does NHTSA need, do you think?
I think there's two things they need. The first is that traditionally they have not enforced the general government desire to make use of existing industry consensus engineering standards. And NHTSA has not done that historically. The framework proposed in 2020 goes there, and I think that they need encouragement. They may even need a mandate to go down that path and figure that out. The second thing is they need more staffing. They are chronically understaffed in computer expertise. They have a small ability to hire now in that area, but they've been understaffed for a couple decades, and they need to really beef up their capabilities in that area to keep up with this technology. And that's probably going to require funding.
So the appropriations process cutting 15% off of NHTSA's budget this year from the President's request probably wouldn't be helpful. Dr. Koopman, You talked about potential new jobs, better jobs, training. For a lot of folks who are concerned about the future of autonomous vehicles, can you elaborate on some of those examples?
Some examples are, we heard earlier that if there's a problem in the middle of the ride, which my friends tell me this is happening regularly, that there's a remote staff to help people out. Well, those are jobs that are going to be created that aren't there now. Another one is going to be higher skilled technicians and higher skilled safety drivers, because every new software release, which will happen monthly or weekly, basically forever, needs testers to make sure it's safe before it's put out in the wild. And another one is some of the jobs will be there but change in nature. Somebody still has to babysit a hazardous load even if the truck is driving itself. Someone's got to be there to unload the crates until that part gets automated. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities, but they're a little bit different than just a driver behind the wheel.
Thank you. And there are concerns about our constituents' rights, like access to the courts, avoiding forced arbitration, designating manufacturers as the responsible entities, protecting state laws and common laws. And Mr. Chairman, we have a letter from dozens of consumer groups talking about these types of concerns. If I move to introduce them.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered.
And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Georgia, Mr. Allen, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Bilirakis, for convening this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. I strongly support the development of self-driving vehicles, and I'm glad we are considering Representative Latta's discussion draft today, which would establish a preemptive national standard for these vehicles for the future. If Congress does not act on this issue, I believe it's a matter of national security. Allowing China to lead in the development of AVs would cause serious damage to our automotive and technology sectors. An important component of Mr. Latta's draft is language that would increase the number of AVs that the DOT may provide an exemption for if they qualify as safe or safer than the current federal motor vehicle safety standards. As a small business entrepreneur, one of the reasons I came to Congress was to make sure that the federal government supports our startup industries and is not a roadblock. For AV companies to be able to prove their value in the free market, they must be allowed to sell their vehicles. This is a question from Mr. Bazzola and Mr. Shapiro. NHTSA has a standing government order to require manufacturers to report all crashes involving vehicles equipped with advanced driver assistance systems or automated driving systems. Unfortunately, the reported data does not specify whether the crashes were caused by those vehicles. Do you have concerns with the lack of transparency in this reporting system, and do you think this reporting problem could lead to consumer confusion over the safety of these vehicles? And I'll start with you, Mr. Bazzola.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I agree that context is really important here. And I'm not sure that the data in the standing general order provides the appropriate context. And so as we do consider, for example, what the future of the standing general order would be and how we think about data and transparency, I think making sure that we have context is important. And I agree with you 100% that that's important to consumer awareness and confidence in the technology going forward, that we understand what's working and the overall context. In other words, how it fits in with what's happening on the roads more broadly.
Right. Mr. Shapiro?
Thank you. I would agree with that. Right now, under the standing order, you have to report just about anything. And it counts if a bird hit your car, or there's social media report that there was a self-driving vehicle involved in an accident, even though it may not have happened. So those are counted in the statistics. So they really need to be sharpened up, frankly. But I think if you look at the absolute numbers, which are incredibly low, especially more recently, almost no deaths, very few injuries, some minor crashes, it's phenomenal. And there's the opportunity that everyone in this country has, is to pay lower insurance rates, to have a whole new creation of jobs, lower costs, and stop the carnage. Mm-hmm. And that's what we need to do.
Right, exactly. Well, I remember when the horse and buggy was replaced by the automobile, all these people were scared to death of that. Mr. Bozzola, yeah, I watch movies, okay? How can we encourage productive collaboration between government and private sector to deliver this important technology for the American people?
I think collaboration is essential. And what we can do is ensure that we have the certainty of a comprehensive regulatory framework for the testing and deployment at scale. That's where the partnership is at its most essential. You mentioned a moment ago you're concerned about startups. This is an opportunity for a rising tide to lift all boats. There is so much activity happening with innovation, technology, and startups in this country that will benefit as this industry goes to scale.
And I've got about 39 seconds. You know, obviously we have some preemptive legislation here. Obviously we hope it's bipartisan and it moves very rapidly, but things don't happen that quick up here. But I see this as a great opportunity to expand this economy. Would any of you disagree with that? Okay.
No,
so
sir.
this is the future. Absolutely. Great. Thank you very much. And I yield back, Chair.
Appreciate it very much. Now I'll recognize Ms. Trahan for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our expert witnesses for taking the time to be here today. As many of my colleagues have already said, this committee has a long-standing history of working to ensure that the automotive industry prioritizes the safety of families who ride in their cars. And it's my hope that we can once again find bipartisan consensus to ensure that that legacy continues, particularly when it comes to the issues of autonomous vehicles. Like millions of families across our country, I'm excited by the promise of AVs, and I share in the belief that we need to do everything in our power to make sure they're deployed safely. And I'm grateful to my colleagues who have rightly pointed out the many concerns, safety concerns with AVs. And instead of repeating much of what's already been said, I'd like to talk about the impact of AVs on the more than 4 million Americans who rely on the driving profession. Just as ATMs reduced the need for bank tellers and self-checkout lanes displaced many cashiers, I'm concerned that AVs, once deployed at high volumes, are destined to displace Americans employed as drivers. And while our committee only covers the personal vehicle portion, AVs have the potential to cause even greater effects to commercial and public transportation sectors, potentially displacing bus and truck drivers and delivery workers as well. Dr. Coatman, both of these bills would set the rules of the road for decades to come and set precedents that other committees and policymakers will follow. Shouldn't Congress consider workforce protections while drafting legislation that could have such a lasting effect?
Yes, absolutely. This technology can affect the workforce just like any other technological innovation. But it's also important to ensure the safety of the workers who are in the vehicles being driven by this technology as well.
Thank you. And as exciting as the promise of AVs are in our changing economy, we can't afford to write off those who could be displaced by the rapid deployment of AVs as the cost of this technological advancement. Dr. Coatman, are there opportunities for Americans who are gainfully employed in the driving profession to transition to some high-quality jobs that may become available as AVs are more broadly deployed?
Yes, I think there are. I think it's important to recognize that this is not you wake up the next morning and all of a sudden all the truckers are out of job. That's not going to happen, and I see other witnesses nodding along. It's not going to happen. This is going to take years to play out. That doesn't mean, as was mentioned earlier, this is a 20, 30-year perspective. I get that eventually we'll get there, but it's not an overnight thing. So the aging out of the current workforce also factors in. But the big thing here is, yes, the jobs will be changed, and it's going to be important to make sure those workers land on their feet with other jobs, such as I mentioned before, in the back room, helping intervene when there's a problem on the road, making sure that the safety's there, more highly trained technicians, because now if the LiDAR doesn't work, somebody could die. You better make sure that LiDAR works. Yes, there's redundancy and so on, but this starts looking more like aircraft maintenance than vehicle maintenance.
Thank you, Dr. Coatman. Mr. Chairman, on that point, I'd like to request unanimous consent to submit for the record several letters from the Transit Workers Union calling on Congress to include workforce protections in AV legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And to my colleague, Congresswoman Dingell, I commend you for working to ensure that unions and workers have a voice in your bill. While I still have a little bit more time, which never happens, state and local governments are largely writing the rules for the road for AV testing on their public streets. Dr. Koopman, again, should state and local governments be permitted to continue to play this role? And would you be concerned about a federal AV framework preempting state and local traffic related to AV testing?
I think that's a great question. I think there's two phases. The first phase is while we're waiting for the federal regulations to actually come into effect, the states need to be able to manage what's going on the roads to protect their constituents. The second part is when that transition does happen, the way I envision it is the federal government still controls equipment as they do, but that should not prevent the ability of the states to control their own locally necessary rules of the road. So the federal government should make sure that the vehicles are able to follow whatever the local road rules are, and the states and localities should be able to set the local road rules responsive to local conditions. So, for example, in Pittsburgh, there's a school for disabled, and the city of Pittsburgh might not want testing to happen at their front doorstep. They should be allowed, if they so desire, to say, no, you can't test on that block.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, many of my colleagues have dedicated their time to talk about safety, and obviously that's an important issue and part of this discussion, but I want to pivot a moment to talk about a different aspect of public safety, namely how to safeguard our individual liberties as American citizens. Several AV companies are offering ride-hail services on apps they control using fleets they own rather than selling those cars to American consumers who may wish to maintain control of their own vehicles, as most of us do today. Many of my constituents are wary of the potential to be forced into autonomous rideshare platforms rather than continuing to own their own vehicle. Mr. Bozzella, how can we ensure that consumers will retain this choice in the future, the choice to own and maintain their own cars, whether they're autonomous or not?
Yes, thank you. What I think you're going to see, in fact, what I know you're going to see with regard to this technology is a number of different use cases. So, for example, when you think about the definition of autonomous vehicles today, we're talking about not only fully autonomous self-drive vehicles with absolutely no driver, but we're also talking about what we refer to as level 3 vehicles, which are very likely to be owned by individuals. And in that case, you have a situation where sometimes the technology, the automated driving system is driving the vehicles, and sometimes the owner or the driver of the vehicle is operating those.
Like
those
Teslas today, where you reach out.
Yes, although Tesla, as I understand it, is not a level 3 vehicle. Those are actual driver assist technologies. We're talking about a step beyond that, and there's a big bright line between assistance technologies and the type of technology I'm talking about. But that's an example where I think you'll see private ownership continue to flourish in a much safer context.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those of us who have watched the development of AI in the past few months have noticed a glaring problem that we have seen with big tech for years, namely the problem of bias, and in this case, programmatic bias. As a strong supporter of the Bill of Rights, I want to make sure that we have strong guardrails in this industry as it takes off, ensuring that we protect First Amendment rights, freedom of religion, speech, assembly, impact of mobility, the Second Amendment, freedom to bear arms, and the Fourth Amendment, freedom from warrantless search and seizures. So I'd like to hear from the witnesses, how do we protect against biased algorithm deciding which locations that AV will or will not go to, like gun shops or houses of worship or such thing? Mr. Shapiro, would you comment on that?
I think that this concern and the one prior will be addressed in time, but I know you want to hear that they could be addressed today. I think the question of choice that you raised in your first question is something that will be debated perhaps 5-10 years from now still, because it would be too premature with so many options out there. There's no mandates anywhere. In terms of algorithmic bias, in terms of location, I can't imagine that's going to occur unless it potentially...
Well, I mean, it's already occurring with Airbnb. It's already occurring with some other app-based services where, you know, based on some political position you take, your support for certain constitutional rights prohibits that private contractor or private ownership company from allowing individuals to stay there and possibly for an AV, like we're talking about today, to take that person to that location. Mr. Bozzillo, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I would say this, it would be hard to make a business that's not supportive of choice and customers broadly. What the goal of the companies we work every day with is to expand access to this type of transportation, urban, rural, everywhere, because ultimately it is about safety and it is about choice and it is about freedom of movement. That's what really defines this technology at this stage in the game. So it would be hard for me to imagine a scenario where a company could be successful
Airbnb
doing
is
that.
really successful, and they banned Michelle Malkin just for her political views. How do we ensure that citizens have the right to concealed carry, and it can continue to do so in autonomous vehicles that other people own in a rideshare situation? Mr. Bozzillo or Mr. Shapiro or anyone else on the panel?
I think the way it works today is that companies follow local laws, and that's what they do. Companies are very concerned about their reputations, and the concept of entering social issues is increasingly becoming disfavored because they recognize it's very difficult. So I think companies are just, the number one thing they're trying to do is make sure they go in the areas and follow local speed limits that everyone's talking about. And I can't imagine that they're going to start saying we can't go into this area unless it's considered unsafe for self-driving vehicles or people are like throwing things at them or something. So in terms of issues like gun control or gun rights, depending on your view, I think that's an issue which I'd like to come back to the committee on because I haven't thought about before.
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing companies prohibit services to folks because of their political positions that they've taken publicly. And I just want to make sure it doesn't happen if we're moving toward AVs for rideshare apps, that sort of thing. Mr. Chairman, my time's up. I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Now we'll recognize Mr. Armstrong. Oh, excuse me, Miss, Harshberger's next. I'm sorry.
Okay.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
my pleasure.
This will go to Mr. Bozzillo or Mr. Shapiro. I live in a very rural district in East Tennessee, and not every road's going to be mapped. You can go down a long driveway, long driveways, and it will require the same precision that's required for an autonomous vehicle to operate on the road. And I know there's been tremendous strides in preparing the technology for urban areas, but we can't forget about rural America. What's being done to ensure that the people that live in East Tennessee will be able to reap the same benefits of autonomous vehicles that they do in urban areas?
Well, thank you for the question. Right now, there are over 80 companies in 30 different states that are already operating, already testing, already developing. That needs to be 50 states, and it needs to be everywhere. And the benefits need to be available to everybody. The way to do that is to expand the opportunity to test and deploy across the country. That is what Chairman Lotta's bill does, and it's also what Congresswoman Dingell's bill does. That's the fastest way to get there, is to allow the companies to safely and carefully expand. That's going to allow more use cases. It's going to allow more opportunities in places like your district.
Okay.
I would agree with that. And although I said before I love Congressman Lotta's bill, I'd love it more if it had greater exemptions in it, because if you want to scale up, you want to get into the rural community, you want to get out there, you need to be able to have a commercially viable product.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, sir. Are you doing anything in rural areas like Tennessee or across Tennessee?
There are tests happening and different use cases being explored, whether it's getting people to health care or moving people to shopping and those types of things. There is no question that we need more of that. And as I said, the fastest way to get more of that is to allow companies to scale.
Okay. Mr. Riccobono, would you like to comment on the need for access to transportation in rural parts of our country, sir?
Well, sure. I mean, disability is not geographically bound, right? So,
Right.
yeah, the thing about disability is it can happen to any of us, and so, you know, a lot of times when people experience disabilities, they're living in the community they were in when they acquired that disability, and so that the need for transportation, reliable transportation, is emergent when it happens. So making sure that this technology is available in all communities, including rural communities, is important because, you know, especially when people have acquired disabilities, they're not in a position to move to a different location to continue their life. So having this available and not be geographically bound is really critical to truly making sure that we can all benefit from the technology.
Well, I appreciate that answer, and I guess we'll be looking at exemptions, gentlemen. Thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Anybody want the time? Hey, Mr. Latta, you want some time? Got about a minute, minute 22 seconds.
I'll always take a minute. But, no, first of all, thanks very much for letting me wave on, and I'll get to have my time a little bit later. But let me just say this real quick, and I was just for an opening. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in today's hearing, and I hope to put a finer point on a few areas of interest to our discussion. When I began working on this issue in 2016, AVs were largely an aspirational concept that held the promise of opening new mobility opportunities for our seniors and those with disabilities, reducing congestions on our streets and making our roadways safer. Now, as we sit here today, it's become clear that it's not just a theory. AVs have already traveled millions of miles on American roads, and companies deploying AVs have been reporting any incidents to NHTSA. And let me just say this in my this last 30 seconds of the time. When I started on this legislation, I said two things. Number one, these vehicles have to be as safe as or safer than anything that's on the road today. And the second point is it's safety first, safety last, safety always. Because we want to make sure that people, when they're driving down that road, either in that vehicle or another vehicle that might be autonomous is coming at them, they know it is safe, that you're not going to have something crossing the road on you. So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the minute and a quarter I had, and I appreciate, again, the opportunity to be on the sub today, waving on.
Well, I appreciate that, and that's not taken away from your 5 minutes. I just thought that, I know you're an expert in this area and appreciate your leadership. Now I'll recognize Vice Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Armstrong, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I am by no means an expert in this area. However, I think the second part of safety becomes really important. July 27, 2017, a year and a half before I came to Congress, this committee passed the Self-Drive Act by a vote of 54-0. Unfortunately, that bill died in the Senate, due largely in part to civil liability questions. And it's important because the most common personal injury case are vehicle accidents. In fact, they're 52% of all personal injury cases. And it's July of 2023, 6 years later, and we really haven't addressed those issues. We can address it from science, we can address it from safety, but the second part of that is when somebody gets injured, somebody gets sued. And which means the industry continues to operate without certainty, risking billions in capital and undermining U.S. leadership in this field. Perhaps one day, with the universal adoption of level 5 automation, we will have minimal auto accidents and injury. But the future may allow for a regime in which the current fault-orientated standards yield to a simplified product's liability. This is essentially what Rep. Dingell's draft states, that liability is assigned to the original automated driving system, or replacement automated driving system. However, in the near term, we will see a mix of highly autonomous vehicles and conventional vehicles. That means the current fault-orientated liability regime remains, but with increasing efforts to impose products liability claims against manufacturers of a highly autonomous vehicle. We have already seen warning defect claims and risk utility design defect claims with level 2 vehicles. But let's take a level 3 vehicle, conditional driving automation, and a driver actively monitoring and ready to take over. So the questions are, did the driver act reasonably in taking over the vehicle after an alert? Did the driver respond fast enough to take over the vehicle? Did an unanticipated hazard arise requiring a rapid response which did not provide adequate time for a driver to take over? How do we account for comparative and contributory negligence? And these are all going to be challenging questions for courts to consider regarding design risk, utility, and feasibility. And these issues will be even more challenging for juries as it will require reliance upon expert testimony about advanced automotive engineering. And maybe that is the answer. Leave it to a state-based tort claims law. Perhaps we adopt what some have called a manufacturer enterprise responsibility. This is basically a government compensation fund for those injured. It is financed by an upfront assessment on highly autonomous vehicle manufacturers and no liability on the back end. My question, and it'll be for you, Mr. Shapiro, what liability regime, if any, should we enact for level 3 and 4 vehicles, which allows the industry to mature and produce level 5 vehicles?
Well, thank you for the question, and I appreciate the level. I know you have a litigation background.
Yeah, I'm not nearly smart enough to talk about the science, but
No, I
do know
felt like I was.
when a minivan goes off the road in Florida and 5 people are killed, somebody's getting sued.
I feel this is like my final exam question in law school. You raised the correct issues, absolutely. But the big picture is we got to get and make safer cars, given the carnage on the road. How do we get there? And how do we get there in a way which gets us there quicker? Because every year we get there quicker, we're saving lives and injuries and property damage. You didn't mention the 4.3 million car accidents we had in 2021 and all the costs that imposed on consumers and insurance rates. But right now, I think the federal arbitration standard is good because it basically makes the system much more efficient. It cuts down on the costs involved for all the parties involved. The consumers end up getting more money. The manufacturers may end up paying less, but the system works and there's no slippage through other people trying to make money off it. And the other thing is I think as we get more and more cars on the road, those problems dissipate. It doesn't wait till get to all level 5 everywhere. If we could get 90% of these car accidents out of the way, and as Secretary Buttigieg said, that even if we get AVs reduce 50% of lives, they're still going to be criticized. So we have to also get the public to expect there are going to be issues. What do you do if someone's intentionally has an accident with an AV? What do you do if they're throwing rocks and breaking things? What do you do in different situations? And I think these are areas for discussion, but I don't think Congress has to resolve those today because there's a state tort system which is set up and can resolve them on a state-by-state basis. And if Congress has to then step in, it will step in. But meanwhile, insurance will go down in rates for most consumers, especially if they have self-driving cars.
So I think the science and the technology will get you there, and I think in the totality, you are absolutely 100% correct. But in order to have a commercially viable automobile, you have to have insurance on it. And if you think Congress moves slow, if I can't walk into any car dealership anywhere in the country and buy a car that I can get insured, then we run the real risk of the technology far outpacing the policy. Because I agree on the abstract, it's going to be safer, but each one of these individual cases is still going to be subject to a plaintiff's lawyer, an insurance company, and a defense lawyer. And until we figure that out, unfortunately, this is just a science project.
Well, I won't speak for the insurance industry, but I'd be shocked if they're not willing to have a lower insurance rate for self-driving cars.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize my fellow Florida Gator. I think something like this is going on in Gainesville, isn't it, with AVs? I believe so. So I'll recognize you for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Yes, we actually do have an AV in downtown Gainesville, and it moves not very fast. So there's a lot of frustrations with it, I'll say that. But thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. Go Gators. This is a very important hearing today. Excited to be a part of the conversation. Like my colleague, Representative Armstrong, I am not a science person. I cannot explain the science or the data or the technology, so I'll stick to really what I know. But I do want to, as we jump into this line of questioning, highlight the importance of data security, privacy concerns that have been expressed. I think as we talk about this important issue, we have to have that lens and that concern in the back of our head because this can quickly get out of hand as we've seen in so many areas of our life. I think this has been hit on quite a bit before, but just for the interest of having it on the record for myself, Mr. Shapiro and Congress around the country, many are concerned about the growing threat of the Chinese Communist Party. And we have seen that Americans increasingly, regardless of party affiliation, where they are in the country, any sort of background, they share this concern about the CCP. And tying that into autonomous vehicles and the testing situation that we're faced with, are there any U.S. companies currently testing in mainland China? That's the first question. Second is, are these companies able to send the data that they collect back to the United States from the mainland?
I am not aware of any U.S. companies in testing in China, but I'd like to follow up with a response, especially if I'm wrong.
Okay, no, I appreciate that, but on the,
And the second question, can they transfer data back? There's plenty of laws in China that they have that we don't have.
Right.
And definitely Chinese companies are treated better in the United States by far than American companies are treated in China in almost every way possible. Having closed down our Chinese office there as a trade association, I could tell you part of the concern was for our own American employees.
right.
Because I say things before Congress that are sometimes controversial, and it's
Me too, I get that.
And I think in this room we share a concern that China is a major strategic threat and what we should do about it. But I think we should beat them in the marketplace. And the way we beat them in the marketplace is we get this legislation passed, we get it out there. Of course, we focus on cybersecurity and our own things, but we have to get there because we've done nothing as a government for several years now, and other governments have seen that, and they're speeding ahead. And they don't have the privacy restrictions we have. They don't have the cybersecurity. They don't have the lawyers we have. They don't have everything and the challenges we face. They just get it done, and that's what scares me.
You want to tell me how you really feel? No, and just to put a button on it, there are Chinese companies that are testing in the United States, sending that data back to the mainland, correct?
I know there are Chinese companies testing here. I don't know what they're doing with their data.
You're chomping at the bit down there.
No, I was simply saying, I was going to add that same thing that Gary said. There are definitely Chinese companies testing here. I don't know where the data is going. I have no idea.
I think it's safe to assume that it is making it back, given some of the legislative issues that we contend with here versus over in mainland China.
Could I just add a cautionary note, though? I agree with the intent on the legislation for China, but we have to be very careful. When we're talking about our publicly traded companies, if there are probably shareholders in China, and so if you own even a little bit of an American company, I don't think that should ruin the ability of an American company to do what it has to do to compete in this country and globally, frankly.
I understand, and because I'm running short on time, I want to jump into this next section, but shifting gears, I think we can all agree that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's goal of creating a reporting process for AVs and driver assistance systems and real AVs, it was a good one, right? However, the process that they employed to create this reporting requirement was really incredible and should be part of the record. Instead of using their broad authority under the Safety Act to write a new rule, they used special emergency provisions to escape the Paperwork Reduction Act requirement for notice and comment when putting a general industry reporting requirement in place. Once they did start a comment period, 6 months later, NHTSA gave companies month-to-month notice of extensions for an entire year while they finished the rule. Now, this rule requires reporting of everything from an actual crash to a bird hitting a vehicle to someone posting on social media without any evidence that they were in a crash with an AV. Now, on top of that, if a company incorrectly submits data, NHTSA does not correct or redact inaccurate data from the record. For example, incorrectly labeling Level 2 driver assistance systems as a Level 4 autonomous system before publishing it monthly on their website. Bad data equals bad outcomes and bad decisions. So this committee passed the TREAD Act in 2000, requiring reporting from all OEMs. Now, this committee knows how to structure reporting so that NHTSA can conduct oversight and get the data from industry. The AVSGO misses the mark. Sorry, I know that's a mouthful, but I'm getting to it. Mr. Shapiro, did NHTSA ever reach out to CTA for feedback on reporting requirements, and are you concerned about how they are approaching regulating AVs? And I know I'm over time, but take it away, because I know the chairman wants to hear this answer too.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I'll have to check with our team. But I will say I'm a big fan of the Administrative Procedures Act, and I think it's important that it be followed. And increasingly, as each new administration comes in, it seems we're diminishing the role of Congress and giving the executive agencies ability to, frankly, do things they shouldn't be doing.
Absolutely. I appreciate your commentary. Thank you to all our witnesses, and thank you for everyone for being here in the committee today. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the sponsor of one of the bills in this legislative hearing, Mr. Latta, for your 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and again, thanks for letting me wave on today. Mr. Shapiro, let's talk preemption. Other than the fact that California made clear it needed to preempt its own cities on traveling the state, it seems a bit odd that there wouldn't be a federal policy that didn't recognize the need to cross state lines, especially for this committee. The Interstate Commerce Clause is very important. Would you provide some perspective on the need to establish preemptive standards to set uniformity over the design, performance, and construction of AVs? Because I sure don't want to be driving in a AV in Northwest Ohio and get to the Indiana or Michigan line and it just says we're pulling over.
I agree with the premise of the question. What distinguishes the United States, which has been incredibly innovative and successful, from our friends in Europe, is that we have the national ability to reach our 330 million or so marketplace with standardized products. To the extent we deviate from that, we're hurting our competitiveness. And Europe hasn't had a lot of innovation in a lot of areas, to be honest, lately, for a whole bunch of reasons, and I think they're the model that we love them, but we don't want to emulate them. And I think if you have to change your license plate and change your rules as you cross straight lines, that's a problem. New York has a rule that says that every car there, you have to have a foot in touching the brake and things like that. Or there's rules which are difficult and impossible to follow. So I do agree, though, that there is state and local rights. They have the right to set speed limits. They have the right to figure out their traffic and what they're doing. And there's areas of overlap and balance.
Sorry about that. It's 55 as you cross the next road. You know, we understand that. But we're talking on the preemption side, that bumper to bumper.
Well, certainly self-driving, if we deploy it as your legislation and the Dingle complement envisions, we will reduce the bumper to bumper, we'll reduce the disparity in speed among the different cars, we'll be more efficient, we'll be greener, we'll have fewer parking structures, we'll greater deploy cars in a sense that right now the average car is used about 10 to 12 hours a week. These cars could be used 40 to 50 hours, they could be shared, they could be cheaper, they won't have the heavy weight that's required and the cost of having all the driver features. The opportunities here are enormous, and I can't say that we could predict exactly what they will be, but just any one of them is great. Empowering the disabled, helping the economy, increasing, being more efficient in energy. Look, there won't be people driving around lost anymore. I mean, we're going to get some people off the road, and the driving that's there will be much more efficient. And if we could just get rid of, even 50% of the accidents, we're in great shape. This is like, I've testified before Congress dozens of times now. Let me tell you, this is the most important testimony I feel I'm giving because we got to get there for so many different reasons.
Mr. Bozzella, you mentioned something. I think we need to go back to this. You mentioned about companies out there right now, or, we've been working on this for years, and I know it. There's been a lot of work done by so many different companies. Are we losing companies out there on the innovation side that are just saying, we're going to throw up our hands and say, this isn't going to get done in the United States, and they just can't keep funneling money into a company or into projects that they don't see an end to?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, and that's unfortunate. We are very much, in my opinion, at a crossroads here. There is massive capital that needs to be deployed to develop and build out and commercialize this technology. We've been at it for quite some time. As you referenced in your comments, when we first started this exercise together, it was an R&D exercise. Now we're deploying technology, proving out business cases, and showing use cases. This is critical that we get this done now. We are going to lose more companies and our innovative edge to other countries if we don't do this now.
Just real quickly, how much have we lost? How many companies out there have just said, we give up? And pretty much, as you mentioned about that technology and that expertise going someplace else.
Yeah, it's hard to know because there's so much change and flux in this environment right now. New companies starting all the time and challenged companies moving out. But there is certainly one well-known company that was partnered with major automotive manufacturers and I think Mr. Shapiro referenced it in his testimony, a company known as Argo that is no longer operating as a result of uncertainty and capital allocation decisions that had to be made by their partners. This is real. and it could continue to happen if we cannot provide an opportunity and a framework to scale.
Could I just add something quickly to that? I will say, though, that if your legislation becomes law, that will be not only a strong message to those that are already in there, but for others that want to enter and for those that are considering investments and coming up with the money, that's a statement, especially if you include some milestones in the legislation.
Right. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for allowing me to wave on, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe Mr. VC is here, so we'll recognize Mr. VC for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. First responders, police, fire, EMS selflessly put their lives on the line every day to keep our community safe, and autonomous vehicles must not become another danger to our nation's emergency services. And I know that while AVs are being commercially deployed in limited areas, we've seen them in Arlington, Texas, we've seen them in San Francisco. I think the San Francisco Fire Department has already logged 66 troubling incidents involving AVs since May 2022, including events in which AVs blocked fire engines, entered into active emergency scenes, and ran over fire hoses. And NHTSA has launched a federal investigation following over a dozen documented cases in which Teslas operating in autopilot mode have crashed into first responder vehicles. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the International Association of Fire Chiefs and International Association of Firefighters and the National Volunteer Fire Council calling on Congress to ensure AVs safely interact with first responders.
Without objection, so order.
And so my first question is to Dr. Copeman. Why are these incidents involving first responders occurring, and is there something we should come to expect as more AVs are deployed?
There are a couple reasons, and the first responder situation is very troubling. The first reason is that the engineering safety standards that I mentioned before that are in that framework tell you, hey, don't forget this, did you think of this, did you think of this, so you can solve the problems before you happen in the real world. And those kind of scenarios are already in those standards. So if somebody's following the standards, they're not going to have those problems. But the second issue is, once the problems started happening, one of the companies did not stand down operations or put a backup driver in the car until they could get it straightened out. They just scaled up. So unless that changes, as there are more cars on the road, we're going to keep seeing the problems till they fix it. Hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, interesting. Dr. Copeman, you've also stated that autonomous vehicle legislation should include rulemakings validating the safety of automated driving systems, the software and sensors actually driving the cars. How would such rulemaking reduce the likelihood of AVs interfering with first responders?
As I mentioned, the engineering standards already have requirements to deal with emergency responder situations. In fact, the Maryland Transportation Authority weighed in on the latest version of the standard and put us in contact with emergency responders to make sure we got those parts right. So there's a lot of good wisdom in the standards. The companies just have to follow them.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent for this letter to be entered into the record. It's from the International Union of Police Associations, which represent active duty law enforcement professionals that are, again, concerned about the broad preemption provisions in AV legislation that may invalidate laws requiring AVs to yield to emergency response vehicles and otherwise operate lawfully in case of emergency.
Without objection, so order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Copeman, I also want to ask you, could preempting state and local laws regarding design, construction, and performance of AVs potentially invalidate state and local traffic laws requiring AVs to yield to emergency vehicles?
I think that's a very real risk. And the way I look at it is completely reasonable for the federal government to control the equipment that can drive the vehicle in various ways. But the states and localities need to keep control over the envelopes of the behaviors that are permissible. So, for example, there may be in an emergency response scene, the emergency responders may need the ability to make sure that vehicle is 100% disabled. And they need to put requirements specific to their unique geographic and other population needs. But the federal government, sure, they should be in charge of making sure the equipment obeys whatever the local traffic laws are.
Yeah, no, thank you.
We don't want preemption to take that away from the localities.
I wanted to ask you also, I know that Representative Dingell's bill explicitly saves state and local traffic laws and requires that NHTSA compete a ongoing proceeding to establish safety engineering practices and standards for computer driver safety. How would these requirements help ensure AVs interact safely with first responders?
Well, the conformance to the standards requires the companies to consider various emergency responder scenarios with some level of specificity and make sure that they've considered in the safety case. A safety case is a well-reasoned discussion based on evidence why they think they're safe, and the safety case has to consider emergency response scenes. And so if the ANPRM is carried forward, it will invoke standards that require considering that during the design of these vehicles.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you for allowing me to wave on.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Now I recognize Mr. Obadonti for his 5 minutes of questioning. I appreciate his patience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to also thank you for allowing me to wave on. This is a really critically important topic for me. I think the technology that's being developed here is going to dramatically change the world for the better, and I think it's incumbent on us here in Congress to get it right when it comes to regulation. Dr. Koopman, I am really glad that you're here because you said something that really resonated with me. You said that the core issue here is public trust, and I completely agree with you. And I also appreciate the fact that the viewpoint that you're bringing to public trust is one that has to be validated by accident data, which I think is correct. I think that we demonstrate that public trust is merited by the accident data that's generated from the AVs, and so I think it's incumbent on us to gather that data. So I wanted to ask you the state of the data that we have right now. Do we have enough data to reach a conclusion about whether or not the current generation of AVs is safer than human drivers?
We're part of the way there, but we're not all the way there. And it's important to note that data only happens after you've been operating, and if you want public trust, I think you need more than that. You need transparency, accountability, and independent oversight, because in things like the 737 MAX crashes, those were what were compromised in that degraded trust. But to make sure I hit your question, the data we have now is about crashes, but it's not about fatalities. It's about 100 million miles between fatality in round numbers for the U.S. fleet. There's lots of tailoring you do, but we're talking 100 million miles. These companies have done 1 or 2 or 3 million miles. So it's great that they have a mathematical prediction and estimation. They think they're safe enough. That's fantastic to hear. But it can only be confirmed by that data you're talking about. And okay, 1, 2, 3 million miles of data, that's great. 97 more million miles to go before we get to 100 million to see how it turns out.
Well, what about the current accident rate for level 2 enabled vehicles? Because those have been here for a few years. Do we have any data to compare the accident rate for a vehicle that is being piloted on level 2 compared with one that's human piloted?
That's problematic. The current SGO data that was talked about before, in fact, one of the most important uses that has not been mentioned is for the level 2 vehicles, the autopilot type crashes. We're seeing lots of fatalities, we've seen lots of crashes, but the SGO does not require enough mileage reporting. So we know how many crashes, we don't know how many miles with the feature enabled, so we can't do the division to compare it to human drivers. So that's, now there have been studies done, there have been claims made. Most of the claims made have also been debunked. So it's hard to say. What I've seen so far is there is no data showing that automated steering improves safety. It's a convenience feature. There is data showing newer cars are safer, but it's not the automated steering. It's the automatic emergency braking. And really, if I had a limited bucket of money to spend on improving highway safety, I'd spend it on the active safety features, because it's a lot more bang for the buck than fully automated driving.
I think context probably matters too. I mean, it's not, from a non-empirical standpoint, it's hard to imagine that a car on a highway being driven with level 2 technology and a human monitoring is not safer substantially than one that doesn't have that technology available, because you do away with things like distracted driving, you do away with things like drunk driving, falling asleep. But we, like as you say, we don't have the data.
Well, you would think but it's not true. National Transportation Safety Board says that you invoke automation complacency, which counterbalances it. So there's no clear reason why it should be safer. Humans are terrible at supervising automation.
Well, as
They're
you said,
terrible.
we won't know until we have the data. Mr. Bozzella, in this conversation that Dr. Copeman and I have been having, I mean, we're talking about this issue of public trust, and we already have a perceptual problem, which you brought up in your testimony, with public trust, because we might have tens of thousands of auto accidents across the country in any given day. But if one Tesla on autopilot gets in an accident on the opposite side of the country, it's front page news. So what do we do with this issue of public trust? Because this is not going to go away. This is going to get worse, because we're never, I mean, perfection is the goal here, but we're not going to have perfection. It's always pursued, never achieved.
Yeah,
How do we establish this trust?
Trust is absolutely essential. If the technology is not trusted, we can't produce these benefits. You are 100% right. I want to make sure that we distinguish, however, between autonomous vehicle technology that this committee is talking about, which is level 3, 4, 5, and assistance technology, which is level 2. There is a bright line. In every case, a level 2 vehicle, the driver must always be engaged in the driving task. And so there's a significant difference between those two technologies and between those data sets. And unfortunately, I think what it will take with the level 2 technology is a combination of things. Education, but also companies making sure that they express limitations of the technology as well as the benefits, and that we work on things like driver monitoring and human engagement. And that's in the infrastructure bill, for example, that was passed on a bipartisan basis. These are things that we need to continue to work on.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'm out of time.
Sorry,
Let
thank
me
you.
let me just point out, though, that, I mean, we need to have a dialogue about the metric. And the metric ought to be, if AVs are substantially safer than a human vehicle, then they are beneficial, regardless of the fact that they will still be causing accidents and fatalities. And that's what we need to communicate to the public. And frankly, I mean, that is a huge barrier, because the public is not going to be receptive to that message.
Agreed.
Anyway, but I will thank everyone for your testimony. I apologize for running over, Mr.
Thank you.
All right. Very informative. I appreciate it very much. I think we're pretty much finished. I tell you, this was a tremendous hearing as far as I'm concerned. Extremely informative. I do, if somebody wants to comment on this, and I'll let Jan also, if she wants to ask a question or make a statement. What about affordability? You know, we talk about access for persons with disabilities, seniors, what have you. I know that the EVs are available, but they're, in some cases, for the average person, they're too expensive. What about affordability? Is that an issue? Do we need to explore that even more? Do you have any opinions on that? Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have opinions, having watched new technology be introduced for 4 decades now. It starts out expensive and rapidly goes down with competition. So the initial introductions of the first cars, because there'll be high demand, will be more expensive. On the positive side, especially if you don't have the driver requirement, you take a lot of costs out of the out of the vehicle. So I think there'll be a balance there. And you know, in terms of the battery required for an electric car, to the extent it's lighter, you need less of a battery, or you can have the same size battery and get obviously further distance. They're physical trade-offs. If the insurance companies respond, we lower insurance costs for a self-driving vehicle. But there will be a transition period. There is a question of trust. The congressman is right about public education is really important.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, obviously we represent competitors. We're an association, so talking about price is what we usually avoid. But in terms of the inputs and the cost and how things operate in a normal introduction environment, every new product that's great and cool, whether it's high-definition television or a faster computer or video game, costs a lot more because the early adopters pay the most money.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I would just add, I agree with what Mr. Shapiro said completely. I would just add the supply chain and manufacturing here in the United States aspect. That's really important, and that's an essential ingredient to the legislation. If we design here and we build here and we have supply chains here, that will help address some of the affordability challenges that we face. And so this gives us the opportunity to control our destiny, this legislation.
All right,
I
very
do have
good. I
something to
appreciate
add as
that.
well, which is, I agree completely, this is all about getting scale, but I think we're not going to get scale until we get safety and reliability. We need to have those two.
Very good. Sir, do you want a comment with regard to the affordability?
Well, take my chance. One thing I would add to this is that this also affords an opportunity for innovative transportation models. And if you think about people with disabilities and also what has happened with rideshare, we can see that these automated vehicles present new ways to present public transportation, paratransit service, limited transportation in certain areas like healthcare. So that also, although it may be expensive, affords new transportation opportunities, and there's a tremendous benefit on the other side of that cost.
Very good. I appreciate that very much. Jan, do you have anything to add?
I just really wanted to thank our panel for the wonderful conversation. Mr. Riccobono, I didn't ask you questions or talk to you, but I wanted to tell you how especially much I appreciate you being just an incredibly articulate and effective spokesperson for the blind community, the needs that you have and the hopes that you have for this technology. All of us are hoping for the best, and I believe committed to work together on both sides of the aisle. Again, a special thank you to Debbie Dingell for all the work that she has put in over the many years. And I do also believe that the devil is in the details. We want to get it right, and I look forward to being part of that and participating with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Let me remind Mr. Koopman that the city of Pittsburgh, you mentioned the city of Pittsburgh, is the city of innovation and technology. That's for sure. So let's work together and get this done for the American people. Appreciate it very much. Let's see what else I have here. I ask unanimous consent that the documents on the staff document list be submitted for the record without objection. So ordered. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business on August 9th. I know I will. So without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thanks so much.
Hey. Yeah, nice job. Yeah. Good to see you, sir. Good work. Okay.
Somebody wants to be Stacy.
It's a flatter buster hearing, right?
Yeah, I know. I hear that.
Yes. Yeah.
Bob Latta, thank
Yes,
you very much.
thank you, thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you for having us. Okay. All right, Kyle? Yep. Do you think we're gonna get to Debbie Dingell, or?
We can try.
So we go this way? Yep. Through here.
What's it? I don't know yet.
Jesse just wanted to say, Stefania. Just wanted to say that you did really well. Thank you so much for everything.
Introduce you to my wife, Sherry.
Hi, Sherry. Nice to meet you. Pleasure. Jesse's fantastic. Well, let's catch up once you have a chance to catch your breath. Okay. That sounds like a plan. Yeah, you did great.
Sherry has a birthday tomorrow. Actually, Mark has a birthday tomorrow.
And Justin has a birthday tomorrow, too.